In a dust-choked frontier town, a solitary man witnesses a young widow and her daughter being auctioned like livestock to settle debts. The crowd watches, judging, whispering, but doing nothing. Something in him breaks. He bids everything he has, ending the spectacle and binding himself to two strangers he doesn't know. It's reckless. It's foolish. But sometimes the most desperate choices become the most defining ones. This is a story about what happens when silence is broken, when shame turns into defiance, and when survival demands more courage than anyone thought possible. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon lurched over another rut, and Silas Boone didn't bother holding on. His hands stayed loose on the reins, his body moving with the jolt like he'd learned to absorb everything life threw at him without resistance. 43 years old, and he still didn't know if that made him resilient or just numb. Red Hollow appeared through the heat shimmer like a mirage that refused to disappear. Same sun-bleached buildings, same crooked church steeple that nobody had bothered to straighten in 15 years, same saloon with the same drunk probably passed out on the same porch. Silas had avoided this place for 3 years, but a broken well didn't care about his preferences. He needed parts. The blacksmith here was the only one within 2 days' ride who stocked the specific valve assembly his pump required. So here he was, back in the town where people still remembered him as the man whose wife and son had died while he was away selling cattle. Where they remembered he'd come home to graves already dug. The main street was busier than he'd expected for a Tuesday. Silas guided the wagon toward the smithy, but the crowd in the town square made him slow. Not a celebration. The energy was wrong for that. People stood in a loose circle, their attention focused on something he couldn't see yet. He should have kept going, should have tied up at the smithy and minded his own business. He didn't. Silas pulled the wagon to the side and climbed down, his boots hitting the dust with a soft thud. He moved to the edge of the crowd, positioning himself where he could see between a banker he vaguely recognized and a woman in a ridiculous hat. The auctioneer stood on a makeshift platform, just boards laid across barrels, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. That's complete settlement of debts owed to the Granger Mercantile and the Red Hollow Bank, all legal and proper, recorded with the territorial office. That's when Silas saw her. The woman stood on the platform beside the auctioneer, her spine straight despite everything. Late 20s, maybe 30, dark hair pulled back severe enough to hurt. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended more times than it had been new, and her hand gripped the shoulder of a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who pressed against her mother's side like she was trying to disappear. Current bid stands at $40, the auctioneer announced. $40 for able-bodied domestic labor, plus the child. Contract term of 18 months to satisfy the outstanding debt of $63.40 plus administrative fees. Silas's stomach turned. He'd heard of debt auctions, but he'd never seen one. Never wanted to. She's pregnant, someone near him muttered. Probably 4 months along, explains why nobody's bidding higher. Damaged goods, another voice agreed, and the kid's sickly looking. The woman on the platform heard them. Silas could tell by the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers pressed harder into her daughter's shoulder. But she didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on some point above their heads, like she was somewhere else entirely. Come now, gentlemen, the auctioneer cajoled. $40 for a woman who can cook, clean, and mend? That's a bargain even with the extra mouth to feed. And the contract's ironclad. She works off the debt or faces legal prosecution. What about the husband? Someone called out. Deceased, the auctioneer said flatly. Cholera 2 months back, which is how we arrived at this unfortunate situation. The debts are legitimate, the auction is legal, and someone here is going to get themselves a hard worker at a fair price. Silas watched the little girl bury her face against her mother's dress. The woman's hand moved to the child's head, smoothing her hair once in a gesture so automatic it probably happened 1,000 times a day. $45. The bid came from a thick-necked man in a good coat, probably a ranch owner from outside town. But just the woman. I don't need the kid. The mother's composure cracked for just a second. Her hand tightened in her daughter's hair, and Silas saw her throat work as she swallowed. The contract stipulates both, the auctioneer said. Can't separate them. Territorial law. Then $40 is my final offer, another man said. Both of them, 18-month term. They can work my boarding house. The auctioneer looked around the crowd with theatrical disappointment. $40 then, going once, $150. The words came out of Silas's mouth before he decided to say them. The crowd turned, people shifting to see who'd spoken. The auctioneer squinted in his direction. I'm sorry, did someone bid? $150, Silas repeated, louder this time. His heart hammered against his ribs. Cash! The murmuring got louder. People were staring now, and Silas recognized a few faces. People who remembered him, who probably had opinions about why a man like him would do something like this. Sir, I don't believe we've met. The auctioneer's tone suggested he smelled something off. The bid is currently at $40 for an 18-month labor contract. Are you saying... I'm saying $150 to clear the debt entirely. Silas stepped forward, shouldering past the banker. No contract? No term of service? Just pay what's owed and be done with it. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed. The debt is $63.40, plus $22 in administrative and auction fees. That's $85.40 total. You're offering $150? Silas said again. He pulled the leather pouch from his coat pocket, the money he'd saved for winter feed and equipment repairs. To settle the debt and any other claims against her. Clear and final. For the first time, the woman looked directly at him. Her eyes were gray, he noticed. Gray like storm clouds, and just as unreadable. This is highly irregular, Dishchum, the auctioneer protested, but Silas could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. An 18-month labor contract might bring in more over time, but $150 in cash right now with no risk of the debtor dying or running off or proving useless, that was real money. Is it legal? Silas asked. Well, yes, technically, if the creditors agree. Then let's ask them. The crowd parted as two men stepped forward. One Silas recognized as the owner of the mercantile. The other wore a banker's suit that had seen better days. They exchanged looks, then nodded. If he's got the cash, the mercantile owner said, I'll take my portion and call it settled. Agreed, the banker added, plus interest accrued to date. The auctioneer looked like he'd just been cheated out of a commission, but he gestured Silas forward. Let's see the money then. Silas climbed onto the platform, very aware of the woman standing 3 feet away. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way she held herself like someone who'd been braced for impact for so long she'd forgotten how to relax. The little girl peered at him from behind her mother's skirt, brown eyes huge and wary. He counted out the bills and coins while the banker and mercantile owner watched like hawks. When he finished, they counted it again, then a third time. Finally, they nodded. Debt satisfied, the banker announced. I'll file the release paperwork this afternoon. And the auction contract is void, the auctioneer added, though he looked like the words tasted sour. Mrs. Kincaid is free of all legal obligation. The woman, Mrs. Kincaid, swayed slightly, like someone had cut strings she didn't know were holding her up. Silas reached out instinctively to steady her, but she stepped back before he could touch her. I don't understand, she said. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't used it properly in days. Why would you do this? Silas didn't have a good answer. He'd just spent nearly everything he had on two strangers for reasons he couldn't explain to himself, much less to her. Seemed like the thing to do, he said finally. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the trap, the ulterior motive, the price she'd be expected to pay. Silas knew that look. He'd seen it in animals that had been beaten. I can't repay you, she said. Didn't ask you to. Then what do you want? The little girl was watching him now too, and Silas suddenly felt the weight of what he'd just done. He'd ended the auction, sure, saved them from whatever labor contract they would have been sold into, but he hadn't thought past that, hadn't considered what came after. I don't want anything, he said, and it was mostly true. But I've got a ranch about 2 hours north of here. It's not much, just me and more work than I can handle. If you need a place to stay while you figure things out, there's room. I don't accept charity. Didn't offer charity. Offered work and a roof. You said you can cook and mend. Yes. Then cook and mend. Earn your keep if it makes you feel better. But the debt's settled either way. You're not obligated to me." She studied him for a long moment, and Silas had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed and found wanting. Finally, she looked down at her daughter, then back at him. "How long?" she asked. "Long as you need. I won't be anyone's property. Wouldn't expect you to be." Another pause. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. "We'll come. Temporarily. Until I can make other arrangements." "Fair enough." Silas gestured toward the wagon. "You got belongings to collect?" "Everything we own is in a bag at the boarding house." The crowd had started to disperse now that the show was over, though Silas caught plenty of sideways looks and heard the whispers starting up. He ignored them and climbed down from the platform, then offered his hand to help Mrs. Kincaid down. She ignored it and climbed down herself, then lifted her daughter down after. "This is Lila," she said, her hand protective on the girl's shoulder. "And I'm Mara. Mara Kincaid. Silas Boone." They collected her bag, which turned out to be a single carpet bag that had seen better decades, and headed for the wagon. Silas loaded it in back while Mara helped Lila climb up to the bench seat. She settled herself between them, the child pressed against her side. Silas stopped at the smithy long enough to collect his valve parts and arrange payment. He'd have to come back with money he didn't currently have, but Ben Forrester had known him long enough to extend credit. Then he guided the wagon back through town, feeling the weight of eyes on them the whole way. They were clear of Red Hollow and a mile down the road before anyone spoke again. "You really don't want anything?" Mara asked. Silas kept his eyes on the road. "Really don't. People don't do things like this. Not without a reason." "Maybe I had a reason." "What reason?" He didn't answer right away, wasn't sure he could put it into words that would make sense. Finally, he said, "About 3 years ago, I was away selling cattle when my wife and son took sick. Cholera. Same as your husband. By the time I got home, they were already buried. The whole town had seen it happen, had been there, but nobody thought to ride out and tell me. They just watched." Mara was quiet for a moment. "So this was revenge? Against the town?" "No." Silas shook his head. "This was me not watching." The wagon rattled along, and Lila's head started to nod against her mother's arm. Mara shifted to make the child more comfortable, and Silas caught a glimpse of her profile, the set of her jaw, the way she held herself like she was still waiting for the next blow. "The ranch is rough," he warned. "House needs work. Well's broken, which is why I was in town in the first place, and I'm not much for conversation. We won't be a burden." "Didn't say you would be. I'll cook and clean and mend, I'll work, but I won't be owned, and I won't be grateful for the rest of my life." Silas almost smiled. Almost. Wouldn't expect it. They lapsed into silence again, and this time it held. The sun beat down, the wagon wheels creaked, and somewhere behind them, Red Hollow continued its existence without them. Ahead, the land stretched out in shades of brown and gold, the mountains blue shadows on the horizon. It was another hour before the ranch came into view. Silas saw it through Mara's eyes and winced. The house sagged on one side where the foundation had settled wrong. The barn needed new boards and a fresh coat of paint it would probably never get. The corral fence was held together more by wire than nails, and the whole place had the look of something slowly surrendering to gravity and time. "This is it," he said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. Mara looked at the house, the barn, the struggling garden plot where weeds had won the war. Then she looked at him. "How long since your wife died?" 3 years? "Looks like longer." "Yeah," Silas agreed. "It does." He pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. Lila had fallen fully asleep now, her small body slack against her mother's side. Mara shifted carefully, trying not to wake her. "I'll show you inside," Silas said. "There's 2 bedrooms. You and the girl can have the bigger one." "Where will you sleep?" "Been sleeping in the barn mostly. House feels too big." Mara's expression flickered with something, pity maybe, or understanding. Silas didn't want either. He helped her down from the wagon, then reached up for Lila. The child stirred but didn't fully wake as he carried her toward the house. She was lighter than she should be, all sharp angles and not enough weight. Up close, he could see the shadows under her eyes, the way her skin looked almost translucent in the sunlight. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. Dust coated every surface. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin. His sleeping roll lay in the corner of the main room where he'd abandoned it that morning. The air smelled stale and closed off, like a place where nothing lived anymore. Mara took it all in without comment. She just pointed to one of the doors. That one? Yeah. He carried Lila through and laid her on the bed, which at least had clean sheets, though they smelled like they'd been stored in a trunk for too long. Mara followed and immediately started fussing with the blankets, tucking them around her daughter with the same automatic care she'd shown in the town square. When Lila was settled, Mara turned to face him. In the dimness of the bedroom, her face looked older, tired in a way that went bone deep. "I need to know what you expect," she said quietly. "I told you. You told me you don't want anything, but you spent $150 on strangers. Nobody does that without expecting something in return." Silas met her eyes. "I expect you to eat when you're hungry and sleep when you're tired. I expect you'll take care of that little girl. And when you're ready, if you want to help around the place, I won't turn it down. That's all." "That's all," she repeated like she was testing the words for hidden meaning. "That's all. And if I decide to leave, then you leave." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "All right, but I'm going to work. I won't just take—" "Suit yourself." Silas left her there and went back outside to unhitch the horse and unload the wagon. By the time he'd finished, the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. He stood in the yard, looking at the house, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. Inside, he could hear movement. Mara, probably, starting to assess the disaster she'd just inherited. He should go in, should help, should at least explain where things were. But his feet wouldn't move. He'd spent 3 years letting this place fall apart around him, and now he'd brought 2 people into the wreckage. The door opened and Mara appeared, her sleeves already rolled up. She looked at him standing there in the yard, then at the house behind her, then back at him. "You got a broom?" she asked. "Barn, left side near the tools." She nodded and disappeared again. 5 minutes later, she emerged with the broom and went back inside. Through the open door, Silas could hear the sound of sweeping, steady and rhythmic. He stood there until the shadows grew long, then finally forced himself to move. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done, and standing around wouldn't accomplish it. When he came back inside after feeding the animals, he found the main room transformed. Not perfect, not even close, but better. The floor was swept, the dishes were washed and stacked, and the air smelled like lye soap instead of neglect. Mara stood at the stove, coaxing a fire to life with wood she must have brought in from the pile outside. "Found some beans and a bit of salt pork," she said without turning around. "Figured that would do for tonight." "That's fine. Coffee's on the counter if you want it." Silas poured himself a cup and sat at the table, which had also been scrubbed clean. He watched Mara work, her movements efficient and practiced. She moved like someone who'd been cooking since she was old enough to reach the stove. "Lila still sleeping?" he asked. "Yes, she hasn't been sleeping well. The boarding house was loud. She can sleep as long as she needs." Mara glanced at him, then back at the pot she was stirring. "She's not sickly despite what those people said. She's just tired and scared. Didn't think otherwise. People assume. They see a thin child and they assume illness or stupidity or worse. People assume a lot of things," Silas agreed. They fell into silence again, but it was different than the silence in the wagon. This felt almost comfortable, or at least familiar. 2 people occupying the same space without needing to fill it with words. Dinner was beans and salt pork and cornbread that Mara somehow produced from the meager supplies in the pantry. Lila woke up for it, still drowsy and confused, clinging to her mother while eyeing Silas with obvious wariness. They ate without much conversation, and when they finished, Mara took Lila back to bed. Silas washed the dishes, it seemed only fair, and was drying them when Mara reappeared. "She's asleep again," Mara said. "I should probably sleep too. It's been—" She trailed off, rubbing her temples. "It's been a long few weeks. Take whatever time you need. In the morning, I'll start on the rest of the house. And I noticed the garden's in bad shape. If you've got seeds, I can try to salvage it.
Mara. She stopped, her hand on the bedroom door. You just got here, Silas said. You don't have to fix everything in a day. Her smile was small and didn't reach her eyes. Yes, I do. That's how this works. I work, you provide shelter. That's the arrangement. There's no arrangement. I told you. I know what you told me. But I know how the world works too. Nothing's free. Everything has a price. So I'm going to work, and you're going to let me.
Because that's the only way I can accept this without feeling like... She paused, searching for words. Without feeling like what happened in that town square. Like I'm being bought. Silas wanted to argue, wanted to tell her it wasn't like that, but he could see it wouldn't make a difference. She needed to work, needed to feel like she was earning her place. He understood that better than he wanted to admit. All right, he said. We'll both work. Together. Fair enough? She nodded and disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Silas stood in the main room for a while longer, listening to the house settle around him. It sounded different with other people in it, less empty. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He took his sleeping roll outside to the barn, the same as he'd done for 3 years. But when he lay down in the hay, staring up at the rafters, he found sleep harder to come by than usual. His mind kept circling back to that moment in the town square. The look on Mara's face when she'd realized what was happening, the way Lila had tried to make herself disappear. He'd spent $150 he couldn't afford. He'd brought 2 strangers to a ranch that was barely functioning. He'd complicated his life in ways he couldn't begin to calculate. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he didn't regret it. Maybe that made him a fool. Probably did. But at least he was a fool who'd done something instead of just watching. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch continued, crickets and distant coyotes and the wind moving through the grass. Inside the house, 2 people slept in beds instead of on a boarding house floor, or in whatever worse situation the auction would have led to. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in 3 years, Silas thought maybe something was enough. Silas woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen. For a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, he forgot where he was. Then the barn rafters came into focus above him, and he remembered. The sun was already up, slanting through the gaps in the barn walls. He'd slept later than usual, which probably meant he'd actually slept instead of just lying there waiting for dawn. He rolled up his bedding and headed toward the house, stopping at the pump to splash water on his face. The mechanism groaned and sputtered. The valve he'd bought yesterday would need to be installed soon or they'd be hauling water from the creek. Inside, Mara stood at the stove, her hair tied back with a piece of string. She'd found his wife's apron somehow, the blue one with the faded flowers. Seeing it on someone else made his chest tight, but he pushed the feeling down and poured himself coffee from the pot on the counter. "Morning," he said. She glanced over her shoulder. "There's eggs, and I found some flour that wasn't completely weevil-infested, so there's biscuits too." "You didn't have to..." "We talked about this last night." Her tone made it clear the discussion was closed. "Sit down. Food's ready." Silas sat. A moment later, she set a plate in front of him, 3 eggs fried in the last of the salt pork grease, 2 biscuits that actually looked edible, and something that might have been gravy if he squinted. It was more food than he'd eaten at one sitting in months. Lila emerged from the bedroom rubbing her eyes. She froze when she saw Silas, then looked at her mother. "It's all right," Mara said quietly. "Come eat." The girl climbed onto the chair across from Silas, her feet dangling well above the floor. Mara set a smaller portion in front of her, and Lila picked at it with obvious reluctance. "You need to eat," Mara said. "Not hungry." "Lila, my stomach hurts." Mara's hand went to the girl's forehead, checking for fever. "Where does it hurt?" "Just everywhere." Lila pushed the plate away slightly. "I don't like it here." "I know," Mara's voice softened, "but we talked about this. We're staying for a little while, just until you figure things out." "I know." Lila slumped in her chair. "But I still don't like it." Silas ate his breakfast and tried to make himself invisible. This wasn't his conversation to join, but Mara glanced at him, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weariness of fighting the same battle over and over. "The chickens need feeding," he said, mostly to fill the silence.
If you want, Lila, you could help with that. The girl looked at him with deep suspicion. Why? Because chickens get cranky when they're hungry, sort of like people. I don't know anything about chickens. Neither did I when I was your age. Someone had to show me.
He pushed back from the table and stood. Come on. Worst they can do is peck you, and they're not very good at it. Lila looked at her mother, who nodded. Reluctantly, the girl slid off her chair and followed Silas outside, keeping several feet of distance between them. The chicken coop was around back, one of the few structures on the ranch that was still in decent shape. Silas opened the door and grabbed the feed bucket, showing Lila how to scatter the grain. The hens came running, clucking and jostling each other.
They're mean, Lila observed. They're hungry. There's a difference.
She threw a handful of feed, then another. One of the braver hens came close enough to peck near her feet, and Lila jumped back. See? Silas said. Not so bad. She almost got me. Almost doesn't count. He handed her the bucket. You finish up. I'm going to check the eggs. He went into the coop and started collecting eggs from the nesting boxes.
Only 4 today. The hens weren't producing like they used to. Probably stress from being neglected. He'd let a lot of things slide. When he came back out, Lila had finished with the feed and was watching the chickens with slightly less fear. My papa used to have chickens, she said suddenly, before he got sick. Silas didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Mama says he's in heaven now, but I don't know if I believe in heaven. That's fair. Do you believe in it?
Silas looked at the sky, the endless blue that didn't care about anything happening below it. I don't know what I believe anymore. Lila seemed to find this answer acceptable. They walked back to the house together, the bucket of eggs swinging between them. When they got inside, Mara was already elbow-deep in cleaning the main room, moving furniture and attacking years of accumulated dust with a vengeance. Found the eggs, Silas said, setting them on the counter. Mara wiped sweat from her forehead. Good, I'll use them for dinner. She looked at Lila. How were the chickens?
Mean, but I didn't die. High praise. Mara's mouth twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. Why don't you see if you can find your slate and practice your letters? Lila made a face but retreated to the bedroom. Mara turned back to her cleaning, and Silas stood there feeling useless in his own house. I need to work on the well, he said finally.
Get that valve installed before we run completely dry. I'll be here. He gathered his tools and headed out to the well housing. The work was tedious and required lying on his back in the dirt while reaching up into the pump mechanism, but at least it was something he knew how to do. His hands knew the motions, even if his mind kept wandering back to the house and the 2 people inside it. He was halfway through the installation when he heard hoofbeats. Silas sat up, squinting against the sun. 2 riders were coming up the road, moving at an easy pace. As they got closer, he recognized one of them, Ben Forrester, the blacksmith from Red Hollow. The other was a younger man he didn't know. Ben pulled up and dismounted, his expression serious. Silas. Ben. Silas stood, wiping grease from his hands. What brings you out here? Thought you should know there's talk in town about yesterday. I figured there would be. It's not just talk. Ben glanced at the house. Is she here? The woman? Her name's Mara, and yeah, she's here. The younger man shifted in his saddle, and Silas caught the glint of a badge on his vest. Not a full sheriff, probably a deputy or town marshal. This is Tom Hendricks, Ben said. He's got some questions. Hendricks dismounted and approached with the careful neutrality of someone trying to do a job he didn't particularly want to do. Mr. Boone, I need to ask about the transaction yesterday. The debt settlement. What about it? There's been a complaint filed. Says you coerced Mrs. Kincaid into an improper arrangement. Silas felt his jaw tighten. Who filed the complaint? That's not relevant. The hell it isn't. Silas looked at Ben. Who was it? Ben hesitated, then said, Marcus Granger. He's saying the auction was legal and proper, and you interfered with the lawful proceeding. The auction was settled legally. I paid the debts in full, in front of witnesses. The banker and Granger both accepted the money. I know that, Hendricks said. And I told Granger the same thing, but he's insisting there's more to it. Says no man spends that kind of money without expecting compensation. The implication hung in the air like something rotten. Silas felt heat rise in his chest, anger he hadn't felt in years. "You want to come inside and ask Mrs. Kincaid herself?" he said quietly. "See if she feels coerced?" "That won't be necessary." "I think it is necessary." Silas started toward the house. "Come on." He didn't wait to see if they followed. He walked inside, where Mara was still cleaning, her sleeves rolled up and her face flushed from exertion. She looked up when he entered, then saw the two men behind him and went very still. "Mara, this is Ben Forrester and Tom Hendricks," Silas said. "Hendricks here is a marshal. He's got questions about yesterday." Mara set down her rags slowly. "What kind of questions?" Hendricks removed his hat. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion. There's been a complaint that Mr. Boone here may have placed you in an uncomfortable situation. I need to verify that you're here of your own free will." "Uncomfortable situation?" Mara's voice was flat. "You mean compared to being auctioned off in the town square?" "Ma'am, I'm here because Mr. Boone offered me a place to stay while I figure out my next steps. I'm working in exchange for room and board. There's no coercion, no improper arrangement, and no compensation beyond food and shelter. Is that clear enough?" "Yes, ma'am, but I have to ask." "Then you've asked." Mara crossed her arms. "Was there anything else?" Hendricks looked at Ben, who shrugged. The marshal cleared his throat. "Just one more thing. The complaint also mentions that you're expecting, and that Mr. Boone may have taken advantage." "Stop." Mara's voice could have cut glass. "I'm pregnant with my late husband's child. Mr. Boone has been nothing but respectful. And frankly, the only people who've taken advantage of me are the ones in Red Hollow who watched my situation deteriorate for weeks and did nothing until they could profit from it." The room fell silent. Hendricks shifted his weight, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "I understand, ma'am. I had to ask." "You've asked. Now you can leave." Ben spoke up quickly. "We didn't mean any offense, Mrs. Kincaid, but you should know that Marcus Granger is pretty worked up about this. He's talking about going to the territorial court." "On what grounds, what?" Silas demanded. "He's claiming the auction was disrupted before it could properly conclude. Says the debt settlement was irregular and should be voided." "That's ridiculous. The money was paid. The creditors agreed." "I know, but Granger's got influence in Red Hollow, and he's got friends in the territorial office." Ben looked genuinely troubled. "I'm not saying he'll win. I'm just saying he's going to try." Mara had gone pale. "If he voids the settlement, then the debt would be reinstated," Hendricks confirmed. "And you'd be subject to the original auction contract." "Like hell she would," Silas said. "Mr. Boone, I'm not the enemy here. I'm just telling you what's happening." Hendricks put his hat back on. "If Granger pushes this to court, you'll both need to appear. Until then, I'd suggest you keep records of everything, how the money changed hands, witness statements, anything that proves the settlement was legitimate." After they left, Mara stood in the middle of the room, her arms still crossed, staring at nothing. Lila appeared in the bedroom doorway, her eyes wide. "Mama, what's happening?" "Nothing, baby. Just some men being foolish." Mara's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "Go back to your letters." Lila hesitated, then retreated. When the door closed, Mara sank into a chair. "This isn't going to stop," she said quietly. "Is it?" Silas sat across from her. "Granger's a bully. He's used to getting his way. And now he's angry because you made him look bad in front of the whole town." She laughed, a bitter sound. "You shouldn't have done it. You should have just walked away." "But I didn't." "No, you didn't." She looked at him, really looked at him, like she was trying to understand something. "Why? And don't tell me it just seemed like the thing to do. Nobody throws away $150 on a whim." Silas took a breath. He'd avoided this question yesterday, but she deserved an answer. "When my wife and son died, I wasn't here. I was 2 days away selling cattle, trying to make enough money to get us through the winter. By the time I got word and made it back, they were already in the ground. The whole town knew they were sick. They watched it happen. But nobody rode out to tell me. They just waited. I'm sorry. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because yesterday when I saw you standing on that platform, I saw everyone watching again, judging, talking, but not doing a damn thing to help. And I thought about how different things might have been if just one person had ridden out to find me. If one person had done something instead of just watching. He met her eyes. So that's why. Because I was tired of watching. Mara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I can't promise this won't blow up in your face. I know. Granger's the kind of man who holds grudges. If he takes this to court, he'll drag both of us through the mud. You could lose more than money. I know that too. Then you're either brave or stupid. Probably both. This time when she laughed, it sounded almost genuine. Well, at least you're honest about it. They sat there in the dusty main room while the sunlight moved across the floor and the world kept spinning outside. After a while, Mara stood up and picked up her rag. I'm going to keep cleaning, she said, because sitting here worrying won't change anything, and at least if we're going to fight, we can do it in a clean house. Silas watched her attack the window frames with renewed energy, and he thought that maybe he'd misjudged her. She wasn't just tired and scared. She was angry, and anger, properly directed, could be a powerful thing. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work. Silas finished installing the valve and got the well pump working again, which felt like a small victory. Mara cleaned the house top to bottom, unearthing things he'd forgotten existed. Lila practiced her letters and fed the chickens again, this time with slightly less fear. By evening, they were all exhausted. Dinner was simple. More beans, some of the eggs, bread that Mara had somehow coaxed into existence from the meager pantry supplies. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation. After dinner, Silas went out to check on the animals while Mara put Lila to bed. When he came back inside, she was sitting at the table with a pencil and paper, writing something. What's that? He asked. A list. Everything I remember about the auction, the payment, who was there. Like Hendricks said, we need records. Silas sat down across from her. You don't have to do this. If you want to leave, I won't hold it against you. And go where? She didn't look up from her writing. I've got no money, no family, and a child to feed. Running won't solve anything. Granger might drop it, might decide it's not worth the trouble. Men like Granger don't drop things. They dig in harder when someone challenges them. She set down the pencil and looked at him. You really didn't think this through, did you? Not particularly. That's what I thought. But there was no anger in her voice, just a kind of weary acceptance. Well, we're in it now. Might as well see it through. We don't have to fight this together. I'm the one who... Silas. She said his name firmly, like she was explaining something to a particularly slow child. If Granger voids the settlement, the debt comes back to me. The auction contract would still be valid. I'd be the one getting sold off to whoever bid highest. So yes, we do have to fight this together, because whether you meant to or not, you tied our fates together the minute you opened your mouth in that town square. She was right, and they both knew it. Silas had acted without thinking about consequences, and now those consequences were spreading like ripples in water, touching both of them. All right, he said. Together then. What do we need to do? First, we need to prove the settlement was legitimate. That means getting statements from the banker and the mercantile owner confirming they accepted your payment willingly. They won't want to get involved. Probably not, but they took your money. They have a stake in making sure the settlement holds. What else? We need to show that I'm here voluntarily, that there's no coercion or improper arrangement, which means, she hesitated, which means we need to be very careful about how this looks. No closed doors when we're talking, no appearances of anything that could be misconstrued. Silas felt his face heat. I know, but appearances matter, especially in a situation like this. People are going to assume the worst. We can't give them ammunition. Fine. What else? Mara looked down at her list. I need to prove I can support myself, that I'm not dependent on you long term, which means I need to find work, some way to earn money. There's work here. You've been doing it all day. That's not the same thing. That's room and board, not wages. If I can show I'm earning actual money, building toward independence, it makes the whole situation look less suspicious. What kind of work? I can sew. I'm good at it. If there are women in the area who need mending, or if someone wants a dress made, I could do that. She touched her stomach absently, at least until this becomes too much of an issue. They talked through the rest of her list, making plans, trying to anticipate Granger's next move. By the time they finished, it was full dark outside, and the lantern on the table was burning low. Mara stood and stretched, wincing. I should sleep. Tomorrow I'll start on the garden if that's all right with you. You don't have to ask permission. Yes, I do. It's your ranch. It's just dirt and struggling plants. Do what you want with it. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good night, Silas. Night. He listened to her move around the bedroom, getting Lila settled, then the creak of the bed as she lay down. The house fell quiet except for the usual night sounds. Wind, distant animals, the settling of old wood. Silas sat at the table a while longer, looking at Mara's list. Her handwriting was neat and precise, each word carefully formed. It reminded him of schoolwork, of someone who'd been taught properly and remembered the lessons. Finally, he extinguished the lantern and headed out to the barn. But sleep didn't come easy. His mind kept circling back to the same thoughts, what he'd started, what it might cost, whether he'd have the strength to see it through. The next morning dawned gray and threatening rain. Silas woke to find Mara already up, working in the garden plot with Lila beside her. They'd pulled out most of the weeds and were trying to salvage what few struggling plants remained. He made coffee and brought 2 cups outside. Mara accepted hers with a nod of thanks, dirt smudged across her cheek. Found some squash that might make it, she said. And there's beans here that just need staking. The soil's not bad, just neglected. Story of the whole place, Silas muttered. Well, we're working on that. She sipped her coffee, looking out at the ranch. How much land do you have? 160 acres. Most of it's grazing land for cattle, but I sold off the herd 2 years ago. Couldn't manage it alone. What about crops? Never had much luck with crops. Catherine, my wife, she kept the garden going, but I don't have her touch for it. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You talk about her sometimes. Your wife, but you never use her name. Don't I? Not until just now. Silas looked at his coffee. Feels strange, saying it out loud, like I'm talking about someone from another life. Maybe you are. Mara turned back to the garden. Come on, Lila. Help me with this row. The day passed in hard work. Silas repaired fence line while Mara and Lila transformed the garden from disaster to something resembling order. Around midday, clouds rolled in and it started to rain. Not hard, just a steady drizzle that turned the dust to mud and made everything slippery. They retreated to the house, where Mara hung wet clothes by the stove and Lila complained about being cold. Silas found an old quilt in the trunk and wrapped it around the girl, who gradually stopped shivering. Tell me a story, Lila said suddenly. Silas looked at her. I don't know any stories. Everyone knows stories. Mama tells me stories all the time. Your mama's better at it than me. Mama's tired. You tell one. Mara gave him an apologetic look. You don't have to. It's fine. Silas sat down, trying to think of something appropriate for a child. All right. There was once a horse named Cinder who was the stubbornest animal that ever lived. Is this a true story? Lila asked. True as anything. Cinder belonged to a man who thought he could break any horse, but Cinder had other ideas. Every time the man tried to ride him, Cinder would buck him off into the nearest mud puddle. Lila giggled. That's mean. That's what the man thought too. He tried everything, gentling, harsh training, bribes with sugar cubes. Nothing worked. Finally, he decided to sell Cinder to someone else and let them deal with the problem. Who bought him? A girl about your age. She didn't have much money, so she got Cinder cheap. Everyone told her she'd wasted her pennies on a worthless horse, but the girl didn't try to ride Cinder. She just talked to him. Every day she'd go to the pasture and sit on the fence and tell him about her day. Did it work? Took 6 months. But eventually, Cinder got curious. He'd come over to listen. Then one day, the girl climbed down from the fence and Cinder didn't run away. She stood next to him, still talking, and when she finally asked if she could ride, Cinder let her. Because she was nice to him, Lila said. Because she didn't try to force him. She just gave him time to decide for himself. Lila thought about this. I like that story. Good. The rain continued through the afternoon and into evening. They ate dinner by lamplight, the sound of water dripping from the eaves a constant backdrop. Afterward, Mara sat with her sewing. She'd found an old shirt of Silas's that needed mending and had taken it upon herself to fix it. You don't have to do that, Silas said. I know, but it needs doing, and I'm good at it. Besides, it's practice. She held up the shirt, examining her stitches. If I'm going to take in sewing work, I need to make sure I haven't lost my touch. How would you even find customers out here? I was thinking about that. There's a settlement about 10 miles south, isn't there? What's it called? Carson's Fork. Not much more than a trading post and a few houses. That's more than nothing. I could ride down there, put up a notice that I'm taking sewing work, see if anyone bites. You can't ride 10 miles alone, not in your condition. Mara's jaw set. I can ride just fine. I didn't mean... Silas caught himself. I'll take you. We can both go. You don't need to babysit me. It's not babysitting, it's practical. If you're going to spread word about your sewing, we might as well spread word about what happened in Red Hollow too. Get our side of the story out before Granger's version becomes the only version people hear. Mara considered this, then nodded slowly. All right. When? Day after tomorrow, if the rain stops. Give the roads time to dry out. They fell into their usual evening silence, but Silas found himself watching Mara work. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, the needle flashing in and out of the fabric. She'd pushed her sleeves up, and he could see old scars on her forearms, small burns, probably from cooking. Evidence of a life spent working. Can I ask you something? He said. She didn't look up. You're going to anyway. Your husband, what was he like? The needle paused mid-stitch. Why do you want to know? Oh, just curious. You never talk about him. There's not much to tell. Robert was a good man. Not perfect, but good. He worked hard, treated me decent, loved Lila. She resumed sewing. We had 4 years together before the cholera came. That's more than some people get. How'd you end up in Red Hollow? Robert had family there. When he got sick, we went thinking they'd help. But his brother had his own troubles, and his sister was already feeding 6 kids on a clerk's salary. By the time Robert died, we were so far in debt I couldn't see a way out. The boarding house charged by the week, the doctor wanted payment, the mercantile wouldn't extend more credit. She shook her head. You know the rest. And there was nobody else? No other family? My parents died when I was 16. No siblings. Robert was all I had. She tied off the thread and bit it clean. Now I have Lila and a baby on the way, and a very questionable living arrangement with a man I barely know who's probably going to regret his good deed any day now. I don't regret it. You say that now. Wait until Granger drags us both to court and ruins your reputation. Didn't have much of a reputation to ruin. Mara actually smiled at that. Fair point. The next day the rain stopped, leaving everything washed clean and slightly steaming in the returning sun. Silas worked on repairing the barn roof while Mara and Lila went back to the garden. Around noon they heard more hoofbeats, and Silas climbed down from the roof to see who was coming. This time it was 3 riders, all men he recognized from Red Hollow. They pulled up in the yard, and the leader, a thin man with a mustache, looked at Silas with obvious distaste. You're Silas Boone? You know I am, Fletcher. What do you want? Fletcher pulled a folded paper from his coat. I'm here on behalf of Marcus Granger. This is a summons. You and the woman are required to appear before the territorial magistrate in 2 weeks to address the complaint regarding the unlawful disruption of a legal debt auction. Silas took the paper, skimmed it. Legal language, lots of whereas and therefore, but the gist was clear enough. Granger was making good on his threat. We'll be there, Silas said. See that you are. Failure to appear will result in a default judgment in favor of the plaintiff. Fletcher glanced toward the house, where Mara had appeared in the doorway. Ma'am, this concerns you too. Make sure you understand the seriousness of the situation. I understand perfectly, Mara said coldly. Fletcher nodded and wheeled his horse around. The three riders left at a canter, kicking up mud from the road. Silas unfolded the summons and read it more carefully. 2 weeks. They had 2 weeks to prepare a defense, to gather evidence, to somehow prove that what he'd done was legal and right. Mara came down the steps, Lila behind her. She took the summons and read it herself, her expression growing grimmer with each line. 2 weeks, she said. Yeah. That's not much time. No, it's not. She handed the paper back. Then we'd better get started. They rode to Carson's Fork the next morning, all three of them crowded onto the wagon bench. Lila sat between Silas and Mara, unusually quiet, her hands gripping the edge of the seat. The road was still muddy in places from the rain, and the wagon wheels carved deep ruts that would probably be there until the next storm. Mara had dressed carefully that morning, her best dress, which wasn't saying much, but it was clean and mended. She'd pinned her hair up properly and even found a bonnet somewhere. Silas had shaved for the first time in weeks, scraping his face raw with a dull razor. They were trying to look respectable, like people whose story deserved believing. "What are we going to say?" Mara asked as the settlement came into view. "The truth. That I paid the debts, you're working for room and board, and there's nothing improper about any of it. And if people don't believe us, then they don't believe us. But at least they'll have heard it from us first, not from whatever version Granger's spreading around." Carson's Fork was smaller than Red Hollow, just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. The trading post doubled as a post office and general meeting place, and when Silas pulled the wagon up in front, he could see several people inside through the dusty windows. "Stay close," Mara told Lila, taking the girl's hand. They walked in together, and conversation stopped. 5 people turned to stare. 2 women examining fabric, a man buying tobacco, and the proprietor behind the counter. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman named Agnes Caldwell, recovered first. "Silas Boone, haven't seen you in an age." Her eyes shifted to Mara and Lila, assessing. "And you've brought company." "This is Mara Kincaid and her daughter Lila. They're staying at my place for a while." Silas kept his voice level, conversational. "Mara's looking for sewing work. Figured we'd spread the word." One of the women examining fabric, younger, with sharp features, made a small sound that might have been disapproval. Her companion, older and softer around the edges, elbowed her quiet. Agnes came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sewing work, you say? What kind?" "Mending, alterations, new garments if someone wants them." Mara's voice was steady. "I can do plain work or fancy, whatever's needed." "You any good?" "Yes." The simple confidence in that single word seemed to impress Agnes. "Well, I've got a pile of mending in back that I haven't had time for. If you want to take a look, we could work out a price." "I'd appreciate that." While Agnes led Mara to the back room, Silas found himself alone with the other customers. The man buying tobacco nodded at him and left. The 2 women went back to their fabric, but they were whispering now, shooting glances in his direction. The younger one finally approached. "Is it true what they're saying? That you bought her at an auction?" "No, I paid her debts so she wouldn't be sold into a labor contract. There's a difference." "But she's living with you now, unmarried." The woman's tone made it clear what she thought of that arrangement. "She's working for room and board, same as any hired hand." "She's not a hired hand, though, is she? She's a woman, a pregnant woman, and you're alone out there with her and that child." The older woman touched her companion's arm. "Sarah, that's enough." "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Mother. It looks improper." Silas felt his temper rising, but kept it in check. "What looks improper is a town that stands around watching while a widow gets auctioned off because nobody else would lift a finger to help. I did what needed doing. If that makes people uncomfortable, that's their problem." Sarah's mouth thinned. "You can't just decide the rules don't apply to you." "I didn't decide anything. I paid money owed, cleared a debt, and offered temporary shelter. Last I checked, none of that was illegal." Agnes returned with Mara before the conversation could escalate further. Mara carried a basket of clothes, her expression carefully neutral. "We settled on a price," Agnes announced. "Mara here will take the mending, bring it back when she's done, and I'll pay her then. If the work's good, I'll spread word that she's available for hire." "Thank you," Mara said. "I'll have this back to you within the week." They made their exit quickly, Silas carrying the basket while Mara held Lila's hand. Once they were back on the wagon, Mara let out a breath. That was about as pleasant as I expected. The young one? Silas asked. Sarah Hammond. I heard her mother call her that. She had opinions about our living arrangement. She shared those opinions with me too. I'm sure she did. Mara settled Lila between them again. At least Agnes was decent about it. If she spreads word about the sewing, we might get somewhere. They were a mile down the road when Lila spoke up. Why was that lady so mean? Mara exchanged a glance with Silas. She wasn't mean exactly, just concerned. About what? About whether your mama and I are doing things properly, Silas said. Some people think a man and a woman shouldn't live under the same roof unless they're married. Lila thought about this. But you're not doing anything wrong. You gave us a place to stay. I know that, and your mama knows that. But other people make assumptions. That's stupid. Lila, Mara warned, but it is. Mr. Boone helped us. Why does that make people mad? Nobody had a good answer for that, so they rode in silence for a while. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning cool. Silas found himself thinking about what Sarah Hammond had said, about how things looked. He'd spent 3 years not caring what anyone thought, living alone and letting the ranch fall apart. Now suddenly appearances mattered, and he wasn't sure how to navigate that. We need to talk about something, Mara said abruptly. Something I've been thinking about since we got that summons. What? She took a breath. We need to get married. Silas nearly drove the wagon off the road. What? Not for real. I mean, legally real, but not like a real marriage. She was speaking fast, the words tumbling out. It's the only way to make this look legitimate. If we're married, then I'm not just some woman living in your house. I'm your wife. The whole improper arrangement accusation falls apart. Mara, I know how it sounds, but think about it. Granger's entire case is built on the idea that you're taking advantage of me, that there's something illicit happening. If we're married, that argument evaporates. You'd have legal standing as my husband to pay my debts. I'd have legal standing as your wife to be there. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. Lila was looking between them with wide eyes. Are you going to be my papa? She asked Silas. No, baby, Mara said quickly. It's complicated. You said you were getting married. I said we might need to, for legal reasons. It wouldn't mean... She stopped, pressing her fingers to her temples. I'm explaining this badly. Silas sat there, the reins slack in his hands, trying to process what she was suggesting. Marriage, legal marriage, to a woman he'd known for less than a week. This is insane, he said finally. I know. We barely know each other. I know that too. And you're pregnant with another man's child. Very aware of that, thank you. So why? Because it's the only move we have left. Mara turned to face him fully. You think Granger's going to give up? You think a territorial magistrate is going to listen to our explanation about temporary work arrangements and believe there's nothing else happening? They're going to look at me, pregnant, widowed, living in your house, and they're going to assume the worst. But if we're married, it changes everything. It changes everything, Silas agreed, including the fact that we'd actually be married, legally bound. That's not something you just undo when it's convenient. I know, and I wouldn't ask if I could think of any other way, but I can't. Her voice dropped. If Granger wins this case, the debt gets reinstated. I get sold to whoever wants to buy an 18-month labor contract. And Lila, she looked at her daughter. Lila gets separated from me because the boarding house man who is bidding doesn't want children. The weight of that hung in the air between them. Silas looked at Lila, who was trying very hard to pretend she wasn't listening to every word. When would we do this? He heard himself ask. Before the hearing. As soon as possible. We could ride to Carson's Fork, find whoever performs marriages there. Get it done. And then what? We just stay married? For now, until this blows over and we figure out what comes next. Mara's hands twisted in her lap. Look,
I know this isn't what you signed up for when you bid at that auction. I know I'm asking for more than you should have to give. But I'm desperate, Silas. And desperate people don't have the luxury of waiting for better options. Silas looked at the road ahead, then back at the ranch behind them, then finally at Mara. She was watching him with those storm-gray eyes, and he could see the fear beneath the determination. She was terrified. Of Granger, of the courts, of losing her daughter. And she was willing to bind herself legally to a stranger because it was the only card left to play. "All right," he said. "All right? All right. We'll do it. We'll get married." He picked up the reins again. "But we do it clear-eyed, no illusions about what this is. It's a legal arrangement to protect both of us. Nothing more." "Nothing more," Mara agreed. "I won't expect anything from you beyond what we already agreed on. Room, board, protection from Granger. That's it. And when this is over, when Granger gives up or the baby comes or you figure out your next step, then we figure out how to end it, quietly. No drama." It sounded reasonable when she said it like that. Practical. A business arrangement dressed up in legal language. Silas told himself that's all it was as he turned the wagon around and headed back toward Carson's Fork. Agnes Caldwell looked surprised when they walked back into the trading post an hour after leaving. "Forget something?" she asked. "We need to know who performs marriages around here," Silas said. Agnes's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Marriages?" "Legal marriages. Who has the authority?" "Well, Judge Whitmore comes through once a month for legal matters, but he was just here last week, won't be back for another 3 weeks at least." She studied them with open curiosity. "There's also Pastor Williams, but he's particular about doing marriages properly. Banns posted, waiting period, all that." "What about the Justice of the Peace?" Mara asked. "That's Judge Whitmore. He handles both." Agnes leaned against the counter. "Mind if I ask what the rush is?" "We'd rather not wait," Silas said. Agnes was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's a man named Coleman about 15 miles west of here. He's authorized to perform civil marriages, got himself appointed as a deputy registrar a few years back. He'll do it quick if you pay him enough, no questions asked." "How much?" $10 usually, maybe 15 if he thinks you're desperate. Silas had maybe $20 left to his name after paying Mara's debts, but what choice did they have? "Can you give us directions?" he asked. Agnes did better than that. She drew them a map on the back of an old receipt, marking landmarks and turnoffs. "Tell Coleman I sent you. He owes me a favor, might keep the price down." They thanked her and left. Sarah Hammond was back in the store now, and Silas could feel her watching them go. By tomorrow, everyone in Carson's Fork would know that Silas Boone and the widow Kincaid had come asking about quick marriages. But that was fine. Let them talk. By the time the talk spread, the marriage would already be done. The ride to Coleman's place took 2 hours. It was a small homestead, well kept but unremarkable. Coleman himself turned out to be a rail-thin man in his 60s with suspicious eyes and hands that shook slightly when he moved. "You want to get married," he said flatly after Silas explained their situation. "Right now, today." "That's right." "And you got witnesses?" Silas looked at Mara, who looked at Lila. The girl was the only other person there. "Just my daughter," Mara said. Coleman shook his head. "Need 2 witnesses for it to be legal. Territory law." "There's 3 of us here," Silas pointed out. "Me, Mrs. Kincaid, and you. I'm performing the marriage. Can't be a witness to my own work." Coleman scratched his chin. "My wife could stand in as one witness, but we still need another." They stood in Coleman's dusty yard, the afternoon sun beating down, trying to figure out how to produce a second witness from thin air. Finally, Coleman sighed. "I got a hired hand around here somewhere. He can stand in, but this is going to cost you $20. "That's robbery," Mara said. "That's the price for quick and quiet. Take it or leave it." Silas paid the $20, watching his reserves dwindle to almost nothing. Coleman counted the bills twice, then nodded and called for his wife. She emerged from the house, a tired-looking woman who didn't ask any questions, just took her place as instructed. The hired hand, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, appeared from the barn and stood there looking confused. "All right, then." Coleman pulled out a small book and flipped it open. Let's get this done. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took less than 5 minutes. Coleman read from his book in a monotone, asking the required questions. Silas heard himself say, "I do," and watched Mara do the same. There were no rings, no flowers, no music, just words spoken in a stranger's yard while chickens pecked at the dirt nearby. "By the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I declare you husband and wife." Coleman snapped the book shut. "You can kiss if you want, but it's not required for the legal part." They didn't kiss. Silas and Mara just looked at each other, this thing now done and binding between them. Coleman's wife and his hired hand signed the marriage certificate as witnesses, then Coleman signed it himself and handed the document to Silas. "There you go, legally married. Try to stay that way. Divorces are expensive and complicated." They rode back to the ranch in silence. Lila had fallen asleep, her head against Mara's shoulder. The marriage certificate sat on the bench between them, the ink still drying. "Well," Mara said finally, "that was grim." "Yeah. I'm sorry. I know this wasn't—" "Don't apologize. We both agreed to it. Still, it's not how anyone imagines getting married." Silas thought about his first marriage, to Catherine. They'd been young, full of plans and hope. There had been a real ceremony, people they loved in attendance, a future they'd believed in. This was nothing like that. This was survival dressed up in legal language. "No," he agreed. "It's not." When they got back to the ranch, everything looked the same as when they'd left that morning. The house, the barn, the struggling garden. But something fundamental had shifted. Silas was married now, to a woman carrying another man's child, to a woman he'd known for less than a week. The absurdity of it should have been funny, but he couldn't quite manage to laugh. Mara put Lila to bed early, the girl exhausted from the long day. Then she came back out to the main room where Silas sat at the table, staring at the marriage certificate. "We should probably talk about logistics," she said. "What kind of logistics?" "Living arrangements. Now that we're married, people are going to expect us to share a room. If we don't, it'll look strange." Silas hadn't thought about that. "You want to move into the main bedroom?" "I don't want to, but it might be necessary for appearances." She sat down across from him. "We could put a curtain down the middle, give each of us some privacy." "Mara, I'm not going to—" "I know. That's not what I'm worried about." She met his eyes. "But other people don't know that. And if we're going to sell this as a real marriage, we need to act like it is one." "How do we do that when we both know it isn't?" "Carefully, we treat each other with respect. We don't contradict each other in public. We present a united front, especially when dealing with Granger or the courts." She paused. "And we probably need to stop calling each other by our first names in front of other people. Husband and wife have a different way of talking to each other." The formality of it felt ridiculous, but she was right. Every detail mattered now. Every appearance, every word, every gesture would be examined and judged. "What about Lila?" Silas asked. "What do we tell her?" "The truth, as much as she can understand. That we got married to protect our family, and that even though it's different from how most marriages work, it's still real in the eyes of the law." "You think she'll understand that?" "She's 7. She understands more than people give her credit for." Mara stood. "I'm going to start moving our things to the main bedroom. Unless you have objections?" "No objections." He helped her move, carrying the few belongings they had from the smaller bedroom to the larger one. There wasn't much. Some clothes, Lila's slate and books, the carpet bag that held everything Mara owned. Silas found an old sheet and rigged it across the middle of the room, creating a makeshift dividing line. "This work?" he asked. Mara tested the sheet, making sure it was secure. "It'll do." That night, for the first time in 3 years, Silas slept inside the house. On one side of the sheet, Mara and Lila were settling in. He could hear them murmuring to each other, the rustling of blankets, the creak of the bed frame. On his side, he lay on his own bed, the one he'd shared with Catherine, the one he hadn't been able to face sleeping in since she died, and stared at the ceiling. He was married. The thought kept circling back, impossible to ignore. Married to a woman who needed protection more than she needed a husband. Married as a strategic move in a legal battle he hadn't asked for. Married in a stranger's yard for $20 and no ceremony worth remembering.
From the other side of the sheet, he heard Lila's voice, small and uncertain.
Mama, are we safe now? We're safer, Mar answered. Try to sleep, baby. I don't like it here. I know, but it's where we are, so we make the best of it. Silence fell, and eventually Silas heard their breathing even out into sleep. He lay awake longer, listening to the house settle around him, trying to figure out how he'd gone from being alone to being responsible for 2 people in the span of a week. The next morning, he woke to find Mara already up, making breakfast. She'd changed into a different dress, still worn, still mended in multiple places, but clean. Her hair was pinned up properly, and she moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd claimed the space. "Morning," she said. "Coffee's ready." "Morning." Silas poured himself a cup and sat at the table. "How'd you sleep?" "Well enough. You?" "About the same." Lila appeared, rubbing her eyes. She looked at Silas, then at her mother, like she was trying to figure out if yesterday had actually happened or if she dreamed it. "Morning, Lila," Silas said. She mumbled something that might have been a greeting and climbed into her chair. Mara set breakfast in front of them, eggs again and some kind of porridge she'd made from oats she'd found in the pantry. They ate in silence until Lila finally asked, "If you're married now, does that mean I should call him Papa?" Mara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "That's up to Mr. Boone." "You should probably just call me Silas," he told Lila. "Papa's. That's a big word. Maybe wait and see if it fits." Lila nodded solemnly and went back to her porridge. The moment passed, but Silas felt the weight of it. This child was looking at him, trying to figure out where he fit in her suddenly unstable world. He didn't have good answers for her. After breakfast, Silas went out to start on the day's work. He was mending fence line when he heard a horse approaching. He straightened, shading his eyes against the sun, and saw a single rider coming up the road at a steady pace. As the rider got closer, Silas recognized him. Tom Hendricks, the marshal who'd come by a few days earlier. Silas set down his tools and walked to meet him. Hendricks dismounted and nodded a greeting. "Mr. Boone, hope I'm not interrupting." "Just working." "What brings you out here?" "Official business, I'm afraid." Hendricks pulled a paper from his saddlebag. "Another summons. This one's from Mara Kincaid's brother-in-law, Robert's brother. He's filed a claim for custody of the unborn child." Silas felt like he'd been punched. "What?" "Fellow by the name of Edmund Kincaid says he's the closest male relative to the deceased Robert Kincaid and therefore has legal standing to claim guardianship of Robert's children, including the one not yet born." "That's insane. The child isn't even here yet. I know it sounds strange, but there's precedent. Territorial law allows for pre-birth custody claims in cases where the mother is deemed unfit or unable to provide adequate care." Hendricks looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Edmund's claiming that Mrs. Kincaid's current living situation, her debts, her questionable arrangements with you, make her unfit." "She's married now," Silas said. "To me, as of yesterday. So her living situation isn't questionable anymore." Hendricks blinked. "You got married?" "We did. Got the certificate to prove it." Silas started toward the house. "Come on, you can see for yourself." Mara met them at the door, her expression wary when she saw Hendricks. "What's happened?" "Your brother-in-law filed for custody," Silas said bluntly. "Of the baby." The color drained from Mara's face. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "Edmund? But he told me he couldn't help. He said he had no resources, no room." "Apparently he's changed his mind," Hendricks said. "Or someone changed it for him. The filing came through the same law office that's representing Granger." Understanding dawned in Mara's eyes. "Granger's behind this. He's using Edmund to get at us." "Looks that way," Hendricks agreed. "But I'm just here to deliver the summons. The hearing's been set for the same day as Granger's complaint, 2 weeks from now. They're combining the cases." Silas retrieved the marriage certificate from where he'd left it on the table and showed it to Hendricks. The marshal examined it carefully, noting the signatures and seal. "This is legitimate," he said finally. Performed by Deputy Registrar Coleman, properly witnessed. It'll stand up in court. Will it matter? Mara asked. If Edmund's claiming unfitness, won't he just argue that a hasty marriage doesn't prove anything? He might.
But it's harder to claim a married woman is unfit than an unmarried one living with a man. Hendricks handed the certificate back. You've strengthened your position, doesn't mean you've won, but you're in better shape than you were. After Hendricks left, Mara sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Edmund, she said quietly, Robert's own brother. I can't believe he'd do this. Granger probably paid him, Silas said, or promised him something. It doesn't matter why. What matters is he's trying to take my baby. Her hand went to her stomach, protective. I won't let him. I don't care what I have to do. Lila had been listening from the bedroom doorway. Uncle Edmund wants the baby? He thinks he does, Mara said. But he's wrong. I don't like Uncle Edmund. He smells like tobacco, and he's mean. Then we agree on that much. Mara looked at Silas. What do? We prepare. We gather every piece of evidence we can find that shows you're fit, that this ranch is stable, that our marriage is legitimate. We get character witnesses, financial records, anything that proves Edmund has no grounds for his claim. In 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, Mara stood abruptly. Then we'd better start now. I'll make a list of everything we need, everyone we should talk to. You work on the financial records, whatever documentation you have about the ranch. They spent the rest of the day preparing, organizing, trying to build a case out of thin air. Silas dug through old papers, finding deeds and receipts and tax records that proved he owned the ranch free and clear. Mara wrote letters to people who'd known her in Red Hollow, asking them to vouch for her character. It felt inadequate, like they were building a wall out of paper to hold back a flood. That evening, as they sat at the table surrounded by documents, Lila spoke up from where she'd been practicing her letters. Are they going to take the baby away? Mara and Silas exchanged glances. Finally, Mara said, They're going to try, but we're not going to let them. Promise? I promise to fight as hard as I can. That's not the same thing. No, Mara admitted. It's not. Because sometimes fighting hard isn't enough. Sometimes bad things happen anyway. But giving up guarantees we lose. So we fight, and we hope, and we do everything we can to win. Lila thought about this, then went back to her letters. But Silas saw her hand shaking as she wrote, saw the way she kept glancing at her mother's stomach like she was trying to memorize something she might lose. Late that night, after Lila was asleep, Mara sat on her side of the curtain, her silhouette visible through the thin sheet. Silas lay on his side, not sleeping, just thinking about everything that had happened. Silas? Her voice was quiet, barely audible. Yeah? Thank you for doing this, for all of it. I know it's turned into more than you bargained for. Seems to be a pattern with me, doing things without thinking them through. Well, I'm grateful anyway. Even if we lose, even if this all falls apart, I'm grateful that someone tried. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They lay there in the darkness, strangers bound by law and circumstance, both of them trying to figure out how they'd ended up here and where they'd go from this point forward. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of preparation. They rode back to Carson's Fork to talk to Agnes Caldwell, who agreed to testify that Mara was taking honest work. They tracked down Ben Forrester, who grudgingly agreed to speak about Silas's character. They even found the banker who'd accepted payment at the auction, though he was clearly uncomfortable about getting involved. Through it all, the deadline crept closer. 2 weeks became 10 days, then a week, then 5 days. Mara worked herself to exhaustion, sewing Agnes's mending by lamplight and tending the garden during the day. Silas pushed himself just as hard, making repairs to the ranch that should have been done months ago, trying to transform the place into something that looked stable and permanent. 3 days before the hearing, Mara went into the kitchen to start breakfast and stopped dead in the doorway. Silas, coming in from morning chores, nearly ran into her. What's wrong? She pointed at the table, where someone had left an envelope. Neither of them had heard anyone approach in the night. Silas picked it up. No name, no markings, just an envelope sealed with wax. He broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, written in an educated hand. Drop the case and leave the territory, or the child will be taken by force if necessary. You've been warned. There was no signature, but they didn't need one to know who'd sent it. Mara read it over his shoulder, her breathing shallow. He's threatening to take the baby by force. He's bluffing, trying to scare us into running. What if he's not bluffing? Silas looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and made a decision. Then we don't give him the chance. We go to the hearing, we present our case, and we win. And if we don't win, we appeal. And if that doesn't work, we take Lila and the baby, and we go somewhere Granger can't reach us. Run, you mean? If we have to, but only if we have to. First we fight. Mara took the letter and walked to the stove. She fed it into the fire and watched it burn, the paper curling and blackening until there was nothing left but ash. All right, she said. We fight. The morning of the hearing, Mara woke before dawn with pain radiating through her lower back. She lay still on her side of the curtain, breathing through it, telling herself it was nothing, just stress, just the baby shifting position, just her body protesting the fact that she'd barely slept in 3 days. But when she tried to sit up, another wave hit, sharper this time, and she had to bite down on her knuckles to keep from crying out. On the other side of the curtain, she heard Silas stirring. You awake? Yes. Her voice came out strained despite her best efforts. You all right? The curtain moved aside and Silas appeared, already dressed. He took one look at her face and crossed the room in 2 strides. What's wrong? Nothing. I'm fine. You're white as a sheet and you're sweating. That's not fine. Another contraction gripped her, and this time she couldn't hide it. Her hand went to her stomach, pressing hard against the pain. Silas knelt beside the bed. How long has this been happening? Just now. It's nothing, just false pains. Women get them all the time. Mara, we have a hearing in 4 hours. We need to be in Red Hollow by 9. I'm not letting some false pains ruin everything we've worked for. Silas's jaw tightened. If you're in labor, I'm not. It's too early. I'm only 6 months along, maybe 7. The baby can't come yet. She forced herself to sit up, though the movement made her dizzy. I'm getting dressed. We're going to that hearing. The hell we are. You need a doctor. What I need is to not lose my daughter and my unborn child to Marcus Granger and Edmund Kincaid. She pushed past him, gripping the bedpost for support. I can handle a few pains. I've handled worse. She made it 3 steps before her legs gave out. Silas caught her before she hit the floor, lowering her back onto the bed with more gentleness than she expected from a man his size. Stay put, he ordered. I'm riding for the doctor. There's no time. Then I'll ride fast. He was out the door before she could argue further. Mara lay there, fighting panic along with the pain. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not today. The hearing was in 4 hours. They had witnesses lined up, documents prepared, a case to present. If they didn't show up, Granger would win by default. Edmund would get custody. Everything they'd fought for would be lost. Lila appeared in the doorway, her face crumpled with sleep and confusion. Mama, where's Silas going? To get the doctor, baby. Are you sick? No, just the baby's being fussy. Come here. Lila climbed onto the bed and curled against her mother's side. Mara wrapped an arm around her daughter, anchoring herself to something solid while her body tried to tear itself apart. The doctor arrived an hour later, a gruff man named Thornton who'd been practicing frontier medicine for 30 years and had seen everything. He examined Mara while Silas paced outside and Lila sat in the corner, hugging her knees. Well? Mara asked when Thornton finally straightened up. You're in labor. Early labor, but labor nonetheless. That's not possible. It's too soon. Baby doesn't care about your schedule. Could be stress brought it on, could be bad luck, could be any number of things. Point is, it's happening. Can you stop it? Thornton shook his head. Once labor starts, it runs its course. Best I can do is try to slow it down, give the baby a bit more time to develop. But you need complete bed rest. No travel, no stress, no excitement. Well, I have a hearing in Red Hollow in 3 hours. I have to be there. Then you'll be having a baby in a courtroom, assuming you make it that far without bleeding out on the road. Thornton packed his instruments with brisk efficiency. I'm telling you as a medical professional, you go to that hearing, you risk both your life and the child's. Is that worth it? Mara looked at Lila, then at her stomach where the baby was fighting to be born too early. If I don't go, I lose custody of both children. If you do go, you might lose everything anyway, including your life. Thornton softened slightly. I understand the stakes here, Mrs. Boone, but dead mothers don't raise children. He left medicines, tinctures and powders that might slow the labor, and strict instructions for bed rest. Silas paid him what little money they had left and saw him out. When Silas came back inside, Mara was trying to stand again. He crossed the room and physically blocked her path. Don't, he said. I have to. You heard Thornton. You go to that hearing, you could die. I don't go. I lose my children. Tell me which is worse. They stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Finally, Silas said, I'll go. Alone. I'll present the case, show the marriage certificate, explain that you're in labor and couldn't travel. The magistrate will have to understand. He won't. He'll see it as exactly what Granger wants him to see. That I'm unstable, unreliable, unable to care for my children. Mara's voice cracked. Please, help me get to that wagon. I can make it if you help me. Mara, I'm going, with or without your help, but it'll be easier with. Silas looked at her for a long moment, then at Lila, who was watching them both with terrified eyes. He let out a breath that sounded like surrender. All right, but we're bringing everything Thornton left, and at the first sign things are getting worse, we turn around. Agreed? Agreed. Getting her into the wagon took 15 minutes and all of Silas's strength. Every movement sent new waves of pain through her body, and by the time she was settled on the bench, she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Silas wrapped her in blankets, positioned Lila beside her for support, and climbed up to take the reins. The ride to Red Hollow was endless. Every rut in the road sent jolts through Mara's body. Every contraction made her grip the edge of the bench until her knuckles went white. Lila sat pressed against her side, silent and small, occasionally wiping tears from her mother's face with the corner of her sleeve. Halfway there, Mara grabbed Silas's arm. Stop. He pulled the horses to a halt. Mara leaned over the side of the wagon and vomited into the dust. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with a shaking hand and nodded for him to continue. We should turn back, Silas said quietly. No, keep going. They reached Red Hollow with 20 minutes to spare. The territorial courthouse was a squat brick building on the main street, already crowded with people waiting for various cases to be heard. Silas helped Mara down from the wagon, and she had to lean heavily on his arm to stay upright. Every eye in the crowd turned to watch them, and Mara could feel the judgment, the speculation, the satisfaction of people who'd predicted this would end badly. Inside, the courthouse was dim and stuffy. Rows of wooden benches faced a raised platform where the magistrate would sit. Marcus Granger was already there, seated at one of the two tables facing the platform. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit, shuffled papers with the confidence of someone who'd already won. Edmund Kincaid sat behind them, looking uncomfortable. When he saw Mara, something flickered in his expression. Guilt, maybe, or shame, but he didn't meet her eyes. Silas guided Mara to the other table and helped her sit. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing through another contraction. Lila stood behind her chair, one small hand on her mother's shoulder. You look terrible, a familiar voice said. Mara looked up to find Agnes Caldwell settling into a bench behind them. Agnes, you came. Said I would, didn't I? Got your mending done too if you're still interested in getting paid. Agnes leaned forward. You in labor? Trying not to be. Well, that's unfortunate timing. You want me to fetch someone? I want you to testify like we talked about. I can do that too. Agnes sat back, her presence somehow reassuring despite everything. Ben Forrester arrived next, nodding at Silas but keeping his distance. Then came the banker from the auction, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Their collection of witnesses was pitiful compared to what Granger probably had lined up, but it was what they had. The magistrate entered, a gray-haired man named Morrison, who'd been appointed by the territorial governor and took his authority seriously. Everyone stood, then sat again on his command. Morrison surveyed the room with eyes that missed nothing, taking in Mara's condition, the tension between the two tables, the packed benches of spectators. "We're here to address two related complaints," Morrison began. "First, a claim filed by Marcus Granger alleging unlawful interference with a debt auction. Second, a custody petition filed by Edmund Kincaid regarding an unborn child. Are all parties present?" Granger's lawyer stood. "Present and ready to proceed, Your Honor." Silas stood as well, somewhat awkwardly. "Present, Your Honor." "And where's Mrs. Kincaid? I see only Mr. Boone." "I'm here." Mara forced herself to stand, though she had to grip the table for support. "Present, Your Honor." Morrison frowned. "Mrs. Kincaid, are you unwell?" "I'm in early labor, Your Honor, but I'm here and able to testify." "Perhaps we should postpone." "No." The word came out sharper than Mara intended. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I've waited weeks for this hearing. I'm not postponing now." Morrison looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. But if at any point you need to stop, you will inform me immediately. Understood?" "Understood." They sat again, and Granger's lawyer rose to present his case. His argument was polished and practiced, that the debt auction had been legal and proper, that Silas had disrupted it through an irregular payment arrangement, that the entire settlement should be voided and the original auction contract reinstated. He painted Silas as an opportunist who'd taken advantage of a desperate woman, and Mara as someone too vulnerable to make sound decisions. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "we have evidence that immediately following this irregular payment, Mr. Boone took Mrs. Kincaid to his isolated ranch where she's been living under questionable circumstances. The hasty marriage that occurred just days before this hearing appears to be nothing more than a legal maneuver to avoid scrutiny." "That's a lie," Mara said. Morrison held up a hand. "You'll have your chance to respond, Mrs. Boone. Continue, counsel." The lawyer called witnesses, people from Red Hollow, who testified about the auction's legitimacy, about the proper procedures that had been followed, about how unusual Silas's intervention had been. He made it sound sordid and suspicious, a transaction that violated both law and decency. Then Edmund Kincaid took the stand. He wouldn't look at Mara as he testified, just stared at his hands and recited what he'd clearly been coached to say, that his brother Robert would have wanted his children raised in a proper home, that Mara's current situation was unstable and inappropriate, that as the child's uncle he had both the right and the duty to seek custody. "And what would you do with this child if custody were granted?" Morrison asked. "Raise it properly, Your Honor, in a Christian home with moral standards and financial stability." "You're married, Mr. Kincaid?" "No, Your Honor, but my sister has agreed to help with the child's care. Between us, we can provide everything a child needs." Morrison made notes. When Edmund stepped down, Mara leaned toward Silas and whispered, "He's lying. His sister won't even speak to him. She moved to California 2 years ago." "Can you prove that?" "No." Granger's lawyer rested his case, looking smug. Morrison turned to Silas. "Mr. Boone, you may present your defense." Silas stood, and Mara could see the discomfort in every line of his body. He wasn't made for courtrooms and legal arguments. He was made for work and silence and enduring things without complaint. But he cleared his throat and began, "Your Honor, everything I did was legal. I paid the debts in full, in front of witnesses, with money I had every right to spend. The creditors accepted payment willingly. There was no coercion, no irregularity. I have the receipts and witness statements to prove it." He handed over the documents they'd prepared. Morrison examined them while the room waited in tense silence. "These appear to be in order," Morrison said finally. "The payments were properly recorded and accepted. However, that doesn't address the question of your subsequent relationship with Mrs. Boone or the hastiness of your marriage." "The marriage is legal," Silas said, "performed by Deputy Registrar Coleman with proper witnesses. I have the certificate." "I've seen it, but the timing raises questions. You married days before this hearing, after the custody petition was filed. It appears strategic rather than genuine." Mara tried to stand, but another contraction hit, and she had to grip the table instead. Silas noticed and moved to her side, his hand on her back. "May I speak, Your Honor?" Mara asked when she could breathe again. Proceed. The marriage was strategic, I won't lie about that. But it was also necessary. My husband, my first husband, died leaving me with debts I couldn't pay and a child to feed. When the auction happened, Mr. Boone gave me a way out. Not because he wanted anything from me, but because he couldn't stand watching another person suffer when he had the power to help. She took a shaky breath. She took a shaky. We married because we're both practical people who understand that sometimes survival requires unconventional choices, but that doesn't make it less real or less binding. And your condition, Mrs. Boone? You're clearly in distress? Is this the kind of environment you believe is suitable for raising children? I'm in labor because stress brought it on early. You want to know what caused that stress? Being threatened with losing my children. Being told I'm unfit because I'm poor and widowed and desperate. Being forced to defend my right to raise my own baby to people who've never lifted a finger to help me. Her voice rose despite her efforts to control it. I've done everything right. I've worked, I've fought, I've married a good man who offered me shelter when everyone else just watched. And now I'm being punished for it because it doesn't look proper to people who've never had to make impossible choices. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to hear from some of your witnesses. Mrs. Caldwell, please approach. Agnes testified about the sewing work, about how Mara had been professional and skilled, how she was clearly trying to build independence. Ben Forrester spoke reluctantly about Silas's character, confirming that he was known as an honest man who kept his word. The banker verified that the auction payment had been legitimate and properly handled. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then Morrison turned to Edmund. Mr. Kincaid, you claim your sister will help raise this child. Where does she currently reside? Edmund shifted in his seat. I'm not certain of her exact location at present, Your Honor. You're not certain, but you're confident she'll help with childcare? She's expressed interest in the past. When was this? Edmund didn't answer. Morrison made another note, his expression unreadable. Here's what troubles me, Morrison said finally. Mr. Granger, you claim the auction was disrupted, but the evidence shows the debts were paid in full, and the creditors accepted payment. That makes your complaint difficult to sustain. Mr. Kincaid, you claim unfitness, but I see a woman who's working to support herself, who's legally married, and who's clearly fighting to keep her family together. That doesn't suggest unfitness to me. Granger's lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, the irregularity of the entire situation. I've heard your argument, counsel, and I'm unconvinced. Morrison looked at Mara. Mrs. Boone, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a truthful answer. Are you being coerced in any way? Is your husband forcing you to stay or threatening you or taking advantage of your situation? No, Your Honor. If anything, I'm taking advantage of him. A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the courtroom. Morrison's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Very well. Here's my ruling. Mr. Granger, your complaint is dismissed. The debt settlement was legal and properly executed. You have no grounds to void it. Mr. Kincaid, your custody petition is denied. You've provided no credible evidence of unfitness, and your own testimony suggests you lack the resources to care for a child. Mrs. Boone retains full custody of both her daughter and her unborn child. Relief flooded through Mara so powerfully that she felt lightheaded. Beside her, Silas let out a breath he'd probably been holding for days. However, Morrison continued, I have concerns about Mrs. Boone's current condition. I'm ordering a follow-up review in 3 months to ensure the child is healthy and the living situation remains stable. If at that time I find evidence of neglect or unfitness, I will revisit this decision. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor, Mara managed. Then we're adjourned. Morrison brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. The courtroom erupted in noise, people talking, moving, reacting. Granger was already storming out, his lawyer close behind. Edmund sat frozen in his seat, staring at nothing. Agnes pushed through the crowd to grip Mara's hand. You did it, she said. You actually did it. We did it, Mara corrected. Thank you for testifying. Least I could do. Now get yourself to a proper bed before that baby decides to make an appearance right here. But Mara didn't make it to a bed. She made it as far as the courthouse steps before her water broke, warm fluid soaking through her dress, and puddling on the wooden planks. She looked down at it, then at Silas, and said with perfect calm, "I think we have a problem." The next few hours existed in fragments, pieces of memory that didn't quite connect into a coherent whole. Silas carrying her to the wagon. Someone, Ben Forrester maybe, riding ahead to fetch Dr. Thornton. The agonizing ride back to the ranch with Lila crying and Silas pushing the horses harder than was safe. By the time they arrived, Mara was barely conscious, the pain so overwhelming it had become almost abstract. Thornton was already there, his sleeves rolled up, barking orders at Silas about boiling water and finding clean linens. "How long has she been in active labor?" Thornton demanded. "Since this morning, maybe 6 hours." 6 hours and you took her to a courthouse? Thornton looked like he wanted to hit something. "Get out of here. I'll call if I need you." Silas retreated to the main room where Lila sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest. He sat beside her, not knowing what to say or do. From the bedroom came sounds he tried not to hear. Mara crying out, Thornton's gruff commands, the bustle of urgent activity. "Is Mama going to die?" Lila whispered. "No. How do you know?" "Because she's too stubborn." Lila looked at him with those huge brown eyes, trying to decide if that was a good enough answer. Before she could respond, a thin wail cut through the air, unmistakably the cry of a newborn. Silas stood so fast he nearly knocked Lila over. They both stared at the bedroom door, waiting. The crying continued, growing stronger, more insistent. Then Thornton appeared, his shirt sleeves bloody, his face exhausted. "Boy," he announced. "Small, but breathing and fighting. Mother's alive, barely. Lost a lot of blood. Next few hours will tell if she makes it." "Can I see her?" Lila asked. Thornton looked at the girl, then at Silas. "Give me a few minutes to get things cleaned up. Then you can come in. But quietly. She needs rest." He disappeared back into the room. Silas and Lila waited in silence that felt like it lasted years. Finally, Thornton reappeared and gestured them forward. The bedroom looked like a battlefield. Blood-soaked linens were piled in the corner. The air smelled of sweat and copper and something else Silas couldn't identify. Mara lay in the bed, her skin waxen, her eyes closed. She looked dead except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. In a basket beside the bed, wrapped in clean cloth, the baby squirmed and fussed. "Mama?" Lila approached the bed tentatively. Mara's eyes open, just barely. "Hey, baby. You're okay?" "Tired, but okay." Her gaze shifted to the basket. "Did you see him?" Lila peered into the basket. "He's really small." "He came early, but he's strong." Mara's eyes found Silas. "We won?" "We won!" Morrison dismissed everything. "Good." Her eyes started to close again. "That's good." "Mara, stay awake," Thornton ordered. "I need you to stay awake for a while longer." But she was already drifting, her body shutting down to conserve what little strength remained. Thornton checked her pulse, frowned, checked it again. "She's slipping," he said quietly to Silas. "I've done what I can, but she lost too much blood. Sometimes the body just gives up." He looked at Lila, then back at Silas. "You might want to prepare the girl, just in case." Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. "She's not going to die." "I hope you're right, but hope doesn't always win." Thornton left more medicines and strict instructions. Keep her warm, try to get fluids into her if she woke, watch for fever or signs of infection. Then he packed his bag and left, his shoulders heavy with the weight of too many patients he couldn't save. Silas sent Lila to bed in the main room, promising to wake her if anything changed. Then he pulled a chair beside Mara's bed and sat down to wait. The baby fussed intermittently, probably hungry, but Mara was in no condition to feed him. Silas did what he could, dipping a clean cloth in sugar water and letting the baby suck on it. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Mara's breathing stayed shallow but steady. The baby cried and quieted and cried again. Silas dozed in the chair, jerking awake every time Mara stirred or the baby made noise. At some point in the deepest part of the night, Mara's eyes opened. She looked around, disoriented, then focused on Silas. "You're still here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Where else would I be? Smart men run from situations like this. Then I guess I'm not that smart. She almost smiled. The baby? Right here, small but loud. Like his mother. Her hand moved slightly, reaching. Silas understood and brought the basket closer so she could see. He looks like Robert. Does he? Around the eyes and the chin. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. For what? All of this. You paid $150 for a quiet life and ended up with a courtroom battle, a hasty marriage,
And a newborn that isn't even yours. You're right, that's not what I signed up for. Mara's face fell, but Silas continued. What I signed up for was watching, just standing by while bad things happened to people who didn't deserve them. I'm glad I didn't stick to that plan. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me, just stay alive. That's all I'm asking. She nodded weakly, her eyes already closing again. But this time when she slept,
it looked more natural, less like someone slipping away and more like someone simply exhausted. Silas sat back in his chair and let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe they'd actually make it through this, all of them, together. The sun was rising when Lila crept into the room, her hair tangled from sleep. She looked at her mother, then at the baby, then at Silas. Is she better? Getting there, I think. Can I hold him? The baby? Silas carefully lifted the baby from the basket and showed Lila how to support his head. She sat in the chair, cradling her brother with the serious concentration of someone given an important task. What's his name? She asked. Your mother hasn't said yet. I think we should call him something strong, since he had to fight so hard to get here. That's a good idea. They sat like that as morning light filled the room, Lila holding the baby, Silas watching Mara breathe, all of them suspended in the fragile space between what they'd survived and what might come next. Mara named him James, after her father. It took her 3 days to be strong enough to say it out loud. 3 days of drifting in and out of sleep while her body fought to recover from losing too much blood. Silas spent those days moving between the bedroom and the rest of the ranch, trying to keep everything running while also keeping 2 children alive and a newborn fed. The feeding was the hardest part. Mara was too weak to nurse properly, and the baby was too small to latch well even when she tried. Silas rode to Carson's Fork and came back with goat's milk and a makeshift bottle that Agnes Caldwell had dug out of her own storage. It wasn't ideal, but James took to it better than expected, sucking down the milk with the determination of someone who'd fought hard to be born and wasn't about to give up now. On the 4th day, Mara managed to sit up without help. On the 5th, she walked from the bed to the chair by the window, a distance of maybe 10 feet that left her sweating and shaking. On the 6th, she held James for more than a few minutes without her arms giving out. You're pushing too hard, Silas told her when he found her trying to stand at the stove, one hand gripping the counter for support. I'm tired of being useless. You gave birth a week ago. You're allowed to be useless. No, I'm not. She turned to face him, and he could see the fear beneath her stubbornness. Morrison said 3 months. 3 months and he reviews our situation to make sure everything's stable. If he comes here and finds me bedridden, finds you doing everything while I lie around, he'll find exactly what anyone would expect to find after a difficult birth. Or he'll find proof that I can't handle my responsibilities, that Edmund was right about me being unfit. She gripped the counter harder. I need to be strong enough to show him I can do this. Silas understood. The battle might be won, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. Morrison's 3-month review hung over them like a sword waiting to fall, and they both knew that one wrong impression could undo everything they'd fought for. All right, he said. But you build back slowly. You push too hard, you'll just set yourself back further. She nodded, but he could tell she wasn't really listening. Mara had survived by pushing through impossible situations, and she didn't know how to do anything else. The days settled into a new rhythm. Mara forced herself through small tasks, washing dishes, folding laundry, sitting in the chair while she mended clothes Agnes had sent over. Lila helped with James, learning to change his clothes and rock him when he fussed. Silas worked the ranch and tried not to think about how little money they had left, or how winter was coming and they weren't remotely prepared.
2 weeks after the hearing, Ben Forrester rode out with news from Red Hollow. "Thought you should know," he said, accepting the coffee Mara offered. "Granger's leaving, selling his mercantile and moving to Denver." Silas and Mara exchanged glances. "Why?" Silas asked. "Pride, mostly. After Morrison dismissed his case, the whole town turned on him. Folks started remembering every time he'd overcharged someone or extended credit with unreasonable terms. The mayor suggested it might be time for him to seek opportunities elsewhere." Ben took a sip of coffee. "He left 3 days ago. Doubt we'll see him again." "And Edmund?" Mara asked quietly. "Still in Red Hollow, last I heard. But he's keeping his head down. I don't think he'll cause you any more trouble." After Ben left, Mara stood at the window, watching the road where Granger would have traveled days ago, carrying his defeat with him to Denver, or wherever men like him went when their power crumbled. "Do you think it's really over, Geet?" she asked. "The legal part is," Silas said. "The rest, I don't know." She turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're married, legally bound. We did it for protection, and it worked. But now we have to figure out what that actually means." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Morrison's review is in 2.5 months. After that, if everything goes well, we could talk about dissolving the marriage. Quietly. Like we planned." "Is that what you want?" "I don't know what I want." She looked tired, and not just from the birth. "A month ago, I was being auctioned off in a town square. Now I'm married to a man I barely know, living on a ranch that's falling apart, trying to raise 2 children and recover from nearly dying. I don't have the luxury of wanting things. I just have to survive them." Silas understood that feeling. He'd spent 3 years surviving instead of living, and it had gotten him nowhere except deeper into isolation. But he also understood that some things couldn't be forced. They'd figure out what they were to each other in time, or they wouldn't. Either way, pushing for answers now wouldn't help. "Fair enough," he said. "We focus on the review. Make sure Morrison sees what he needs to see. Everything else can wait." The weeks that followed were hard in ways that had nothing to do with legal battles or physical recovery. They were hard in the quiet, grinding way that comes from learning to live with someone when neither of you chose each other for the right reasons. Mara was used to being independent, to making her own decisions without consultation. Silas was used to being alone, to silence and solitude, and not having to consider anyone else's needs. They bumped against each other constantly. Mara rearranged the kitchen to be more efficient, and Silas couldn't find anything for a week. Silas decided to repair the chicken coop without mentioning it, and Mara spent an hour looking for him thinking something had happened. Small things that shouldn't have mattered but did, because they were both exhausted and scared and trying to build something resembling a life from pieces that didn't quite fit together. One night, about 6 weeks after James was born, they had their first real fight. It started over something stupid. Silas had sold 3 chickens in Carson's Fork without telling Mara first. She'd been counting on those eggs to supplement James's goat milk, and now they'd have fewer eggs, and he hadn't even thought to mention it. "You can't just make decisions like that without talking to me," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "I needed the money. We're running low on supplies. I know we're running low, but those chickens were producing. We needed them. We needed the money more. That's not for you to decide alone. This affects all of us. I'm the one who owns the ranch. I think I get to decide what to sell." The words came out harsher than he meant them, and he saw Mara's face go still and cold. "Of course," she said quietly. "It's your ranch, your decision. I'm just the woman you bought at an auction, temporarily inconveniencing your life. That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is. It's exactly what you meant." She stood, her hands shaking. "I work this ranch same as you. I cook and clean and care for your house and try to make something useful out of this disaster. But at the end of the day, it's still yours. I'm still just passing through." "Mara, I'm going to bed. Try not to sell anything else while I'm sleeping." She walked away, and Silas sat at the table feeling like he'd stepped wrong in the dark and fallen into something deeper than he'd expected. He'd meant the words practically. He did own the ranch. The decision had been practical. But he heard how they'd sounded. Like she didn't matter, like her work and presence didn't count.
He gave her an hour, then knocked softly on the bedroom door. "Can I come in?" Silence. Then, "It's your house." He pushed through the curtain to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, James sleeping in the basket beside her. In the dim light, she looked younger somehow, and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "I'm sorry," he said. "What I said about the ranch being mine, that was wrong. But true. True on paper, maybe, but not true in any way that matters. You've worked harder than I have to make this place livable. You've put more into it than I have in 3 years." He sat down in the chair, keeping some distance between them. "I'm not good at this, at having people around, at thinking about how my choices affect others. I've been alone too long." "I'm not good at it either," Mara admitted. "At depending on someone, at having to consult before making decisions. Robert and I, we worked together, but I still had my own space, my own choices. This feels different. Because it is different. We didn't choose this. We built it out of desperation. And now we're stuck with it. Maybe stuck isn't the right word." Mara looked at him. "What would be the right word?" Silas thought about it. "Bound, maybe. We're bound together, legally and practically. But that doesn't mean we can't figure out how to make it work." "How do we do that?" "I don't know. Talk more, maybe. Stop making assumptions about what the other person needs or wants." He paused. "And I should have asked you about the chickens. You're right. That affects everyone, and I should have consulted you first." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I moved your tools in the barn, reorganized them without asking. That probably annoyed you." "A little," he admitted. "I'll put them back." "No, your system's probably better than mine anyway." He stood. "We're going to keep bumping into each other, you know. Keep having these moments where we forget we're not alone anymore." "I know. But maybe that's not the worst thing. Maybe we just have to learn as we go." Mara nodded slowly. "All right, we learn as we go." It wasn't a grand reconciliation or a moment of deep connection. It was just two tired people agreeing to keep trying, which sometimes was all you could ask for. The weather turned cold as October gave way to November. Silas worked longer days trying to prepare for winter, cutting wood, reinforcing the barn, hunting when he could to put meat away. Mara pushed herself harder than Thornton would have approved, determined to be strong enough for Morrison's review. James grew slowly but steadily, his cry becoming stronger, his eyes focusing on faces and tracking movement. Lila, caught in the middle of everything, tried to make herself useful. She fed chickens, collected eggs, helped with James, and rarely complained. But Silas noticed her drawing pictures on her slate when she thought no one was watching. Pictures of a different house, a different family, a father who wasn't dead, and a life that didn't require constant fighting. One afternoon, he found her sitting on the porch, crying quietly while she clutched a button that had come off her dress. "What's wrong?" he asked. "It's stupid." "Tell me anyway." She held up the button. "It's from my Sunday dress, the one Mama made me before Papa died. But the dress doesn't fit anymore, and Mama says we need to use it for scraps because we can't afford new fabric. And I know it's just a dress. I know we need the fabric, but..." She wiped her face roughly. "It's all I have left from before." Silas sat down beside her. "It's not stupid to want to hold on to things. Everything's different now. Papa's gone. We're here. Mama's married to you. There's a new baby. And I know I'm supposed to be grateful because it could be worse, but sometimes I just want things to be how they were. I understand that. Do you? Because you seem fine with everything." Silas looked out at the ranch, at the land he'd let deteriorate because he couldn't bear to maintain it after Catherine and their son died. "After my wife and son passed, I spent 3 years wishing things could go back to how they were. I kept their clothes, their belongings, everything exactly where they'd left it. Thought if I just waited long enough, maybe the world would realize it had made a mistake and give them back to me. But it didn't. No, and all that waiting, all that holding on, it didn't change anything. It just kept me frozen." He looked at the button in her hand. "Keeping that button won't bring your father back or make things how they were, but it also won't hurt anything to hold on to it. Some things are worth keeping, even if they don't serve a practical purpose. Mama says we can't afford sentiment. Your mama's had to be practical her whole life. That doesn't mean she's right about everything. He stood and held out his hand. Come on, let's go see if we can find a way to keep the button and use the fabric. They went inside and found Mara at the table, mending one of Silas's shirts. She looked up, taking in Lila's tear-stained face and Silas's expression. What happened? Lila wants to keep the button from her Sunday dress, Silas said. I told her that seemed reasonable. Mara's mouth thinned. We talked about this. The fabric can still be used, but the button can be saved, maybe sewn onto something new later, so it's still hers. Mara looked at her daughter, and Silas saw the moment she understood what this was really about. Not a button, not a dress, but a little girl trying to hold on to pieces of a life that had been torn apart. All right, Mara said quietly. We'll keep the button, and when we have money for new fabric, we'll make something special for it to go on. Lila threw her arms around her mother, and Mara held her tight, her eyes meeting Silas's over her daughter's head. Something passed between them, an understanding, maybe, or just acknowledgement that they were trying. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but trying. 2 weeks before Morrison's review, Agnes Caldwell showed up with a wagon full of supplies. What's all this? Mara asked as Agnes started unloading bags of flour and sugar. Payment for the sewing you've been doing, plus a bit extra. Turns out telling women in Carson's Fork that I knew a good seamstress brought in more business than I expected. You've got a pile of work waiting if you want it. I want it, Mara said immediately. Figured you would. I also brought fabric, nothing fancy, but enough for you to make a few things. Call it an advance on future work. Agnes pulled out a bolt of blue cotton. Thought maybe you could make something for the girl. She's outgrowing everything. Lila's eyes went wide. Really? Really? And before you ask, yes, you can put that button you've been carrying around on whatever we make. Agnes winked at her. Word travels in small communities. Can't keep secrets. They spent the afternoon measuring and cutting, Agnes teaching Lila basic stitches while Mara worked on a pattern. For the first time since Silas had known her, Mara looked relaxed, her hands moving with confidence through work she understood and was good at. You should think about doing this more, Agnes said. Proper seamstress work, I mean. There's demand for it and you've got the skill. I've thought about it, but I'd need space, supplies, a way to advertise. Start small. Work from home. Build up a reputation. Once Morrison's review is passed and you're in the clear, you could even think about opening a shop in Carson's Fork. I'd invest in it if you asked. Mara looked startled. You would? You're good, you're reliable, and you work harder than anyone I know. That's worth investing in. Agnes paused. Plus, I like the idea of sticking it to all those people who thought you'd fail. Nothing satisfies me more than proving smug people wrong. After Agnes left, Mara stood in the middle of the main room, surrounded by fabric and supplies, looking dazed. What? Silas asked. I think I just got offered a future. A real one, not just surviving day to day. You gonna take it? I don't know if I can. Morrison's review, the ranch. James, Morrison's going to see exactly what he should see. A woman working hard, building a life, caring for her children. And if you want to build a business on top of that, then you should. Silas picked up James, who was fussing in his basket. You're not alone in this. You've got help now, whether you want it or not. Mara smiled, and it reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. I think I'm starting to want it. Morrison's review fell on a cold December morning. He arrived without fanfare, riding up to the ranch with a clerk in tow to take notes. Silas and Mara met him at the door, both of them trying to look calm and competent despite their nerves. Mr. and Mrs. Boone, Morrison said, dismounting. Thank you for receiving me. Of course, Your Honor, Mara said. Please, come inside. Morrison took his time, observing everything. The clean house, the stocked pantry, the bedroom where James slept soundly in a proper cradle Silas had built. He asked questions about their routine, their finances, their plans for the future. He spoke with Lila, who answered politely but warily. He examined the ranch, noting the repairs that had been made, the garden plot prepared for spring planting, the livestock in decent condition. I understand you've been taking in sewing work, Mrs. Boone, Morrison said. Yes, Your Honor. I've built up a small client base in Carson's Fork. Agnes Caldwell can vouch for the quality of my work. Ma, I've already spoken with Mrs. Caldwell. She spoke quite highly of you. Morrison made a note. And you're managing this work while caring for an infant and maintaining the household? With help, Mara said, glancing at Silas. My husband takes on extra work so I can focus on sewing when James is sleeping. Lila helps with household tasks. We work together. Morrison studied them both, his expression unreadable. Finally he said, When I saw you 3 months ago, Mrs. Boone, I had concerns, the rushed marriage, the premature birth, the legal complications. It all painted a picture of instability. But what I see today is different. I see a functional household, healthy children, and 2 people who've clearly worked hard to build something stable. Mara's hand found Silas's, gripping tight. Therefore, Morrison continued, I'm closing this review with a favorable assessment. You retain full custody of both children with no further oversight required. As far as the territorial court is concerned, this matter is resolved. The relief was so powerful that Mara swayed on her feet. Silas steadied her, his own heart pounding. Thank you, Your Honor, he managed. Don't thank me. You did the work. Morrison prepared to leave, then paused. One more thing. Mr. Kincaid, Edmund, he submitted a letter last week withdrawing any future claim to the child. Said he'd been wrong to pursue custody in the first place. Thought you should know. After Morrison left, Mara walked outside and just stood there, breathing in the cold December air. Silas followed, giving her space but staying close. It's over, she said finally. It's really over. Yeah, we won. We did. She turned to face him, and there were tears on her cheeks. I didn't think we would. I kept waiting for it all to fall apart, for Morrison to find some reason to take them away. But we actually did it. You did it. You fought harder than anyone should have to fight. We did it, she corrected. You and me and Lila and even James in his own way. We all did it together. They stood in the yard as snow started to fall, light flakes that melted as soon as they hit the ground. Inside, Lila was probably reading to James, her voice carrying through the thin walls. The ranch looked better than it had in years, the house warm and lived in, smoke rising from the chimney into the gray sky. It wasn't perfect. The marriage was still strange and undefined, built on legal necessity rather than love. Money was still tight, and winter would be hard. James was still small and would need extra care for months. Lila still had nightmares about her father and cried for things that could never be fixed, but they'd survived. Against Marcus Granger, against Edmund Kincaid, against the judgment of people who'd decided they were doomed to fail. They'd built something out of desperation and determination, and it had held. What happens now? Mara asked. I don't know, Silas admitted. We've been fighting for so long, I'm not sure what we do when there's nothing left to fight. We could try living, just living, without constantly bracing for the next disaster. That sounds good, but I don't know how. Neither do I, Mara said. But we can learn. We've learned everything else together. We can learn this too. They went back inside, where Lila had indeed been reading to James, a story about a brave horse that Silas had told her weeks ago, now transformed in her retelling into something more elaborate and fantastical. James was wide awake, watching his sister with solemn eyes, and Lila was performing the story with gestures and different voices. Everything okay? She asked when she noticed them watching. Everything's fine, Mara said. Morrison's review went well. We don't have to worry anymore. Really? We can stay? We can stay. Lila looked at Silas. All of us? All of us, he confirmed. That night, after the children were asleep, Silas and Mara sat at the table with coffee, something they'd started doing most evenings. It was their time to talk about the day, make plans, or just sit in comfortable silence. I've been thinking, Mara said, about what Agnes said, about starting a real business. You should do it. It would mean changes. I'd need to dedicate more time to sewing, maybe hire help with James and the household eventually. So we'll figure it out. Same as we've figured out everything else. Mara traced the rim of her cup with one finger. And what about us? The marriage, I mean. We got married for protection, and now we don't need that protection anymore. We could talk about ending it, quietly, like we planned. Silas had been expecting this conversation, But now that it was here, he found he didn't have a clear answer.
Do you want to end it? He asked.
I don't know. Do you?
I asked you first.
Mara smiled slightly. When we got married, I told myself it was temporary. A legal arrangement, nothing more. And for a while, that's what it was. But somewhere along the way, she paused, searching for words. It stopped feeling temporary. You're not a stranger anymore. This house isn't a place I'm just passing through. And when I think about the future, I think about it here, with you and Lila and James. That's a lot different than what we agreed to. I know, and if you want to stick to the original plan, if you want to dissolve this quietly and go back to how things were for me was being alone in a falling apart ranch, waiting for my life to end, Silas interrupted. I don't want to go back to that. What do you want? He thought about it, really thought about it. I want what we've built, messy as it is. I want Lila feeling safe enough to ask me questions. I want James growing up in a house that's cared for. I want you having the space to build your business. He stopped, then continued. I want to try turning this marriage into something real. Not because we have to, but because we choose to. Mara's eyes were bright with tears. That's a lot more than a legal arrangement. Yeah, it is. Is that okay? It's better than okay. She reached across the table and took his hand. But we should be clear about what we're choosing. We're choosing each other, but also all the complications that come with it. My grief over Robert, your grief over Catherine and your son, Lila's needs, James's future, the fact that we're still learning how to live together and we'll probably keep fighting about stupid things. I can live with fighting about stupid things. Can you live with a wife who's going to build a business and probably neglect the housework sometimes? Can you live with a husband who's not good at talking about feelings and disappears into work when things get hard? I think we've both been living with exactly that for months now. They sat there, hands clasped across the table, acknowledging what they were choosing. Not a perfect love story, not a fairy tale rescue, but something harder and more real. A partnership built on mutual need that had slowly transformed into mutual respect and maybe, eventually, something more. So we're doing this, Silas said. For real. For real, Mara agreed. Whatever that means. Winter came hard that year, bringing snow that piled high against the barn and winds that howled through gaps in the walls. But inside the house, things were warm. Mara's sewing business grew, women from Carson's Fork and even Red Hollow seeking out her services. Silas worked the ranch and started making plans for spring planting, thinking about crops and cattle, and actually having a future to plan for. Lila started school in Carson's Fork, riding in twice a week with Silas when he went for supplies. James grew stronger, his lungs developing, his body catching up to where it should have been if he'd been born at full term. They had their hard days, days when money ran too low and tempers ran too high. Days when Mara pushed herself too hard, and Silas withdrew too much, and Lila had nightmares that left her crying for her father. Days when James wouldn't stop screaming and the house felt too small, and they all wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. But they had good days, too. Days when Lila came home from school bursting with stories about friends she'd made. Days when James smiled for the first time, a real smile that lit up his whole face. Days when Mara's sewing brought in enough money that they could afford meat for dinner, and Silas could fix something on the ranch that had been broken for years. Days when they sat together at the table, passing James between them, while Lila practiced reading aloud. And it felt like maybe they'd actually figured out how to be a family. In the spring, Agnes made good on her offer and helped Mara open a small shop in Carson's Fork. Just a corner of the trading post at first, but it was hers. Silas built her a proper workbench and shelves for fabric. Lila helped organize supplies and greet customers. James spent his days in a basket near his mother's feet, gurgling and watching the work happen around him. One evening in late April, almost a year after Silas had walked into that town square and made a choice that changed everything, they stood together on the porch, watching the sunset. Lila was inside putting James to bed, singing him the same songs Mara used to sing to her. The garden was planted and already showing green shoots. The barn had a new roof. The ranch looked lived in and cared for, like a place where people planned to stay. "We made it," Mara said quietly. "We did. It's not what I imagined when I was young and thought about what my life would be." "No? I thought I'd have a love story. The kind where you meet someone and fall desperately in love and everything's romantic and perfect. She leaned against the porch railing. This isn't that. Sorry to disappoint. You're not listening. I'm saying it's better. She turned to face him. Love stories are easy when everything goes right. When you're young and hopeful and nothing's tested you yet. But building something when everything's gone wrong, when you're both broken and desperate and have every reason to fail, that takes something stronger than romance. What does it take? Choice. Every single day choosing to stay, choosing to try, choosing each other even when it's hard. She smiled. I'll take that over a love story any day. Silas pulled her close, and she leaned into him, both of them watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Inside, Lila's voice had gone quiet, which probably meant James was asleep. In a few minutes, she'd come out and they'd all have dinner together, the four of them around the table that had once sat empty for years. You know what I think? Silas said. What? I think maybe we got lucky, in the worst way possible, but still lucky. How do you figure? Because if things hadn't gone so wrong for both of us, we never would have found each other. You wouldn't have been at that auction. I wouldn't have been in Red Hollow. We would have just kept living our separate disasters alone. He paused. And I was tired of being alone. So was I, Mara admitted. I just didn't know it yet. The door opened and Lila emerged, James successfully asleep. He's down. Can we eat now? I'm starving. In a minute, Mara said. Come here first. Lila joined them on the porch and Mara pulled her daughter close. The three of them stood there, four if you counted James sleeping inside, watching the last light fade from the sky. They were a family now, forged in courtrooms and crisis, held together by choice rather than blood. It wasn't a perfect family. Silas still had days where the memory of Catherine and his son hit so hard he could barely breathe. Mara still woke sometimes with tears on her face, dreaming of Robert. Lila still mourned the father she'd lost and the easier life she'd never have. James would grow up knowing his father only through stories, carrying a loss he was too young to understand. But they had each other. They had this ranch, this house, this life they'd built from ruins. They had second chances and hard-won stability and the knowledge that they'd survived things that should have broken them. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. All right, Mara said, ushering Lila toward the door. Let's eat before everything gets cold. They went inside to the warm house that smelled of cooking and baby powder and fresh-cut wood, to the table where they'd made plans and fought and reconciled and slowly learned how to be a unit, to the life that had started with desperation and somehow transformed into something worth keeping. Silas looked around at his family, because that's what they were now, no matter how unconventionally they'd arrived at it, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for something built on so much pain. But contentment, maybe, or hope, or just the quiet knowledge that he'd made the right choice that day in Red Hollow, even if he hadn't known it at the time. Sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments. Sometimes strength isn't about never falling apart, but about putting yourself back together with whatever pieces you have left. Sometimes family isn't the one you're born into, but the one you build when you're both too broken to do it alone. And sometimes when you're standing in a town square watching something terrible unfold, the right thing to do is exactly what Silas had done. Stop watching and start acting, even if you don't know where it will lead. Because that's how change happens. Not through grand gestures or perfect plans, but through ordinary people making impossible choices and then fighting like hell to make those choices mean something. Silas had made his choice. Mara had made hers. And together, they'd built something that neither of them could have created alone, a home, a family, a future that looked nothing like what they'd planned, but everything like what they needed. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.